Okay, great. So we're live on YouTube and I'm just gonna let everybody in. And then my screen is gonna go black and then it's up to you guys. So have a great time, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Rida Khan and Nicholas Gabelli and I are the co-hosts for this afternoon's Daniel's Talk, a Glossary of Urban Voids by Sergio Lopez-Pineiro. First, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We recognize that people are joining from all over the world this year as we transition to this new normal. We encourage you to find out the Indigenous history of the land that you currently call home. We are grateful to all those that came before us.
Thank you, Rita. My name is Nick Belli. I'm a student here in the Masters of Architecture program. I'm right now in Montreal, and so I'll just make a quick land acknowledgement that Montreal is the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. Joining us today is Sergio Lopez-Pineiro. Sergio Lopez-Pineiro is an interdisciplinary architect whose work explores voids as social spatial phenomena of freedom, diversity, and spontaneity. He is the director of Holes of Matter, a design studio whose mission is to imagine voids in patterns to redefine relations between individual and collective forms of life. Lopez-Pineiro is the author of the volume Glossary of Urban Voids, published this year by Jovis in Berlin. Mr. Lopez-Pineiro is a lecturer in landscape architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he teaches design studios and theory seminars on architecture and landscape with a focus on the public nature of the built environment. He has previously held the 2006 to 2007 Reiner Bentham Fellowship at the University of Buffalo and the 2014-2015 Daniel Urban Kiley Fellowship at Harvard University. Professor Lopez-Pineiro is a licensed architect in Spain. He trained at the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de Madrid, ETSAM, and received his Master of Architecture degree from Princeton University, where he was awarded the Suzanne Kolarek Underwood Prize.
Thanks for that intro, Nick. And I'll just go over the format for today's presentation. So the format for today's event will first be a presentation from Sergio Lopez-Pineiro with time at the end for questions and answers. This lecture is being recorded and broadcast on our YouTube channel, so please turn off your camera if you do not wish to be recorded. We ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation, and during the question and answers, please type your questions in the chat. Alternatively, you can identify yourself in the chat as someone who wants to ask a question and we can unmute you. And now I would like to invite Sergio Lopez-Pineiro.
Hello, thank you, Rita and Nick, very much for the introduction. Hello, good day to all of you. Thank you very much also to Mason White and to Michael Piper and all the faculty of the Integrated Urbanism Studio for the invitation, and to Aiden, of course, for helping coordinate all this. I hope that this is an interesting and enriching event for all of you. Today, I'll be presenting my book, Glossary of Urban Voids, what it is about, what it says, but also what surrounds it, how it came into being, why it took the form it has, what it implies, etc. And in many cases, I will be reading from the book itself. A Glossary of Urban Voids is a critique collection of over 200 terms regularly used to name the urban void, from terrain vague to buffer zone. Using the glossary as a theoretical tool, the book presents the most relevant questions on the issue of the urban void and its potential role as public space. As you can see in this slide, which is one spread from the book, 156, 157, terms and the definitions have been placed on the left side pages and are arranged in alphabetical order. And my essay containing analysis, annotations, critiques, and overall commentary and study on the urban void is found on the right side pages. As you can see from on the right side on page 157 at the top, I make notes on when to look up specific terms on the left side. So, for example, there it says sea landscape park. So, what do we mean with the term urban void? First of all, well, cities are fabrics of capital accumulation. They are physical entities capable of attracting, absorbing, and holding capital. So as many others, but one person that I admire in his analysis, David Harvey, has argued, cities have arisen through geographical and social concentrations of a surplus product. And consequentially, urbanization has played a particularly active role in absorbing the surplus product that capitalists perpetually produce in the search for profits. End of quote. Cities then can be understood as continuous resource-consuming and capital-holding spatio-temporal fabrics. And the term urban void is used to define the holes that appear within this continuum. Therefore, I would say that urban voids are gaps within the urban continuum of program, capital, expectations, and obligations. These spaces are accidentally or intentionally left outside of this smooth continuum of space, organization, power, representation, infrastructure, and control. The term void signifies a place where capital and social control are no longer in existence. And the use of the term void is not a negative judgment. Rather, it signifies a space of the possible and of expectation. So for example, here, actually, let me go back 1 second. This is the definitions of urban void. Christian Borré, definition number 2, he says there's like 2 kinds of urban void. First one, sites and buildings that derive from the vast arsenal of 19th century infrastructure, such as slaughterhouses, barracks, rail yards, docks, and industrial complexes, and that are now falling into definitive disuse and disrepair. This ruined infrastructure tears huge holes, functionally as well as spatially, in the middle of the urban fabric or in the immediate periphery of city centers. And the second type is the space in between things, between objects and subjects, between my house and my neighbors, between their office and mine. It's traversed by many strangers and is not a meeting place. It has become empty, between quotation marks, because it plays no recognizable role. And this, as you can read there, Borret is citing Secchi, Bernardo Secchi, about whom we will talk in a little minute, in a little bit. Another definition that I think is interesting to me is this one by Torres. The urban void is a conceptual construct devised to render visible a principle of absence that underlies urban space. It is a dual concept, both material, in spaces lacking physical conditions, purpose, design, or function, but also metaphorical, in those deprived of memory, symbolism, or affective content. These are some images that accompany the book. That accompany the glossary. So how can such a space, an urban void, operate as public space? I would say that urban voids are part of the city, as we've been discussing, but they're also located outside of their everyday use. They do not satisfy any functional need, and as a consequence, they are not part of the productive or leisure tissue of the city. Within the city, urban voids are separated from the surroundings, creating a space of seclusion outside of cultural norms and rules. Due to the condition as exteriors to urban space, urban voids can be understood as places outside of the cultural norms and the capital interests that rule urban space. What happens in an urban void? Due to their status as marginal spaces, this is something that I've been briefly discussing, but I think that you all are familiar with this idea. These places offer freedoms distinct from and not found within traditional public spaces. This is important. They offer something that regular public spaces cannot offer. The emergence of this alternative type of publicness can also be considered a result of a temporary process of whiting out typical public decorum and public rules. One example of such a place could, by now very well known, is the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, and a decommissioned airfield where Berliners started to occupy spontaneously and temporarily, and where at a point in time when the Berlin City Hall wanted to develop it into more productive fabric, the Berliners raised against that decision.
So I just had some questions.
Should I continue, or was there really a question? I think I should continue. Okay. And so as I was saying, at some point, the Berlin City Hall wanted to develop the airport, and Berliners rise against that decision. Eventually, there was a referendum called, and Berliners asked for the Tempelhof Airport to remain as such. Daniel Campo, who is one of the authors that are quoted and cited in my book, he's the author of The Accidental Playground, has richly described this type of experiences afforded by another urban void. In this case, it's the abandoned yard of the former Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal. And I quote, "It served basic recreational needs of some, but not all local residents, including a place to experience beauty, solitude, play, or the company of others, but was not mere substitute for a city park. People could and did do what they wanted, whether it was to swim in the river, have a barbecue, build a skate park, practice loud music, play with fire, or create art out of found rubble. It was a place without explicit rules. You did what you wanted, but with the understanding that others would do the same." It also allowed for drug use, sexually charged activity, aggressive panhandling, and a number of other illegal or uncivil acts. But the experience of most was peaceful. So urban voids, in this way, I write in the book, that are both failures of collective will and becomings of individual spontaneity. Due to their categorization as failures, they are represented as marginal within the social and cultural imagination of the city. But as potentials, however, they become places of seclusion, separated from the everyday urban fabric, that can help unleash people's individual imaginations. This simultaneous double perception of failure and potential is what makes the urban void such a potent alternative to standard public spaces. Another case study of this kind of very clear alternative type of public space would be these images by Dougal Sheridan in his article, The Space of Subculture in the City. These are images of Berlin. This is the Wagendorf, very close to the Reichstag. And you can, as you can see here in the image and the caption, this is like from the mid-90s. Incredible to imagine such an alternative lifestyle in the heart of Berlin in today. So this is a little bit briefly the framework of the potential that urban voids can have as openings within the city. But what was the process that these spaces that we call urban voids followed to be framed in such a way? What happened? So beginning in the 1960s and continuing into the mid-1990s, most of the professional attention dedicated to questions regarding vacancy came from urban planning. And in this context, vacancy, it is fair to say, was mostly seen as a spatial and social urban problem that could and should be resolved. As such, it had to be quantified as a form of waste with an assigned value. And this article by Ray Northam, Vacant Urban Land in the American City, this is early 1970s, 1971, exemplifies this position or this understanding surrounding vacancy. Northam was not studying urban spaces that today we would call urban voids, but his understanding of vacancy as undeveloped land, as a problematic issue, is a good example of the mentality with which urban voids were later studied. Alice Coleman's here, 11 years later, 1982, in Dead Space, a very well-known article, Dead Space in the Dying Inner City, is a study of the causes of the emergence of urban voids. So beyond the field of city planning, Casabella should be pointed out as the place where architects and urban designers first started to become acquainted with and to systematically address urban voids. And this happened a little bit later, 1984. This is June 1984. Casabella included a section entitled Un problema urbano, l'occasione dei vuoti, in which different authors analyzed opportunities in urban voids. And included in this section, it's I would say a really, really important article, a text by Bernardo Secchi, Il vuoto, which was curiously translated into English in its plural form, voids. And this article offered an outlook on urban voids that was not as practical and straightforward as the one previously shown by planners. And Secchi argued, and I'm quoting, I'm reading, "It is not simply a matter of areas and structures deprived of an original function or role. Along the edges, especially of the peripheries, are vast areas which, rather than witnessing a past, talk of a future, which events have discarded. Enclosed agricultural areas taken over by buildings are now excluded from the countryside, not yet part of the city, but awaiting some use which now appears unlikely. The void represents a design theme which cannot easily be brought back to conceptually simple solutions, to conserve, to restructure, to empty, to reuse, to publicize. The difficulties do not rest primarily or only in finding adequate and well-proportioned functions, or accurately exploring the world of the probable, but also in identifying a possible sense. The design of a void has to start with a theme, and this requires an extension in the field of observation. End of quote. This last sentence is, in my opinion, crucial. The designing of a void, yes, a void can be designed, has to start with a theme, not with a function, not with a role, with a theme, with a sensibility. And this requires an extension. What we know is not enough. In the field of observation, we really have to pay attention. I think this last sentence really encapsulates a very important shift in the understanding and in how to address this type of space. And not even a decade later, this was 1993, Casabella again dedicated a double issue to public space. And amongst the many points of view included, it's a double issue, so it's a very interesting issue. There were several articles, many of which had been written by people that had been writing in this issue in 1984, including Bernardo Secchi and also Stefano Boeri. And they began at that point to frame urban voids as a new type of public space with a new terminology that included labels such as dispersed city or nameless spaces or non-site. And then shortly thereafter, 1995, Ignacio de Solá-Morales published Terrain Vague, the first text, in my opinion, that was able to comprehensively point toward the residual city as an alternative to the planned, efficient, and legitimated city. Here I'm showing the Spanish version, although so this is the text that I first read in Spanish, although the original version is in English. So despite the relative brevity of the article, of the text is able to precisely, and in my opinion, very convincingly reveal a new type of spatial quality or urban space, the urban void. The processes that have produced it, a disconnection from the city's effective circuits and productive structures, and the means that have initially been able to register urban photography. And this is crucial. As you might know, because you might have read it, Solá-Morales really talks extensively about urban photography in his article. Urban photography that had been ongoing for already now approximately 25 years. So, if we take into account the progress or the trajectory, the article, as interesting and incredible as it is, came late. This is a very famous image by John Davis, which typically accompanies the publication of Terrain Vague. And here we can see a typical image of an urban void, what appears to be an abandoned deck, an abandoned dock, with someone sitting by his or her car, quietly fishing, enjoying their time with the industrial city in the background. The article also proposed the necessary sensibilities to engage with it. And I'm quoting, attention to the continuity of the flows, the energies, the rhythm established by the passing of time and the loss of limits. And finally, it also argued for the roles that it can play with the urban continuum: mobility, vacant, roving, free time, liberty. And finally, he encapsulated all these ideas, sensibilities, and means of representation under a name that poetically and very precisely portrayed the spirit of the urban void, and that arguably has forever become its central term, Terrain Vague. So here there's like some definitions that are included in the book about Terrain Vague. The first one coming from Solá-Morales: empty, abandoned space in which a series of occurrences have taken place. I'd also like to read number 5, Luc Levesque. Terrain Vague is a state of indeterminacy. Number 20, Sassen and Oswald. Cities are full of terrain vagues. A place that doesn't have them is not a city. It's something else, perhaps an agglomeration or a suburb, but it's not a city. The notion of terrain vague picks up on the layered spatial history of cities. And finally, Christophe Giraud, the terrain vague must be thought of positively as an opportunity rather than an end, a starting point of landscape of another kind. And so this is also a chronology. I include several indexes in the book, and one of them is this chronology. And as you can see, it was a very slow process of really understanding and shifting the perception around these questions, around this kind of space. From 1971, and from Northern Ray's article, Ray Northam's article, 1982, 1984, 1993, and finally 1995, almost a 25 years process until we have a text like Terrain Vague. And so urban voids then are residues of capitalist processes of urbanization. They are leftovers, abandoned places that are no longer yielding the planned and desired output for which they were conceived. And as such, they are empty of value, productivity, and efficiency. The whiting out of capital turns urban spaces into a marginal state, but simultaneously, they provide them with potential and opportunities. That removal of that value opens up the space for other constituents, for others' imaginations, for other audiences. So as capitalist space breaks down, a new exterior emerges. It is precisely this inherent crumbling of urban space that allows for an exterior to the system to emerge. Capitalism has been framed as a space that knows no outside. In this case, however, the possibility of an exterior in a system that knows no outside is structurally built within the system itself. And this unique opportunity is what makes urban voids both spaces of liberation and insight within cities. There is Eugenio Montale, Forsum mattino andando in un'aria di vetro, I think a well-known poem from 1925. Maybe one morning, walking in dry, glassy air, I'll turn and see the miracle occur. Nothing at my back, the void behind me, with a drunkard's terror. Then, as if on a scream, trees, houses, hills will suddenly collect for the usual illusion, but it will be too late, and I'll walk on silent among the men who don't look back with my secret. He's not talking about urban voids, obviously, but I think that this poem really encapsulates perfectly, in my opinion, what the urban void is. It is precisely that, the secret of the usual illusion of urbanity. It's the backstage. The book, I would like to talk a little bit about the book and how it came into being. It began as a research project that I developed during my time as the 2014-2015 Daniel Irvine Kiley Fellow in Landscape Architecture at the GSD. My initial plan was to publish a reader of texts on the urban void that had been written in the past 25 years, 1995 to 2020, since the original publication of Terrain Vague. And I had planned the reader to be a compendium of the most significant developments, a collection of landmarks, so to speak. But I started to really have doubts about that way of framing and understanding the urban void. Since the publication of Terrain Vague, many texts, as well as several collections of them, have been published. And these publications have advanced the study of the urban void by developing a particular term through its multiple characteristics and applications, for example, urban interstices, loose space, vague spaces, or they have shown varying physical manifestations of the terrain vague as different types of spaces. For example, this book here on the right, Terrain Vague, Interstices at the Edge of the Pale, edited by Manuela Mariani and Patrick Barron, presents innovative ways of looking at marginal space through an array of different spaces, vacant lots, railroad tracks, slots in between buildings, urban wilds, etc. And these two readers, as good as they are, and many of the texts are cited in my book, they exemplify the two questions that arose when I was planning the reader. First is that urban voids should not be claimed by one single perspective in order to protect the wide array of potentials that they hold. And so just talking about one term does not seem like a viable option. And on the other hand, also, how was I going to select these texts? The value of these spaces is that they can be open to many different sensibilities and values. And so reducing the number of voices by selecting a number of texts didn't seem appropriate either. It seemed to be counterintuitive, going in the wrong direction. And so I had started to plan a reader, but here I was with two fundamental questions. How to include multiple voices. This was fundamental, because urban voids are spaces that act as vessels to engage with multiple sensibilities. This question needed to be addressed not just in the content of the book, but also in the method for approaching the subject matter. And the second is how to call this space. How to call a space that, despite having received so many names, continues to defy a precise definition, because the qualities of an urban void are very evanescent, and rightly so, because otherwise it doesn't hold that potential. So naming something is important to demonstrate its existence and urban presence, but each name claims the space for one specific sensibility, discipline, or point of view. So how to name without claiming? And these two questions indicated that doing a reader was not the right medium for me to engage with this type of space. And the glossary emerged as the means to assure the existence of this space while allowing multiple voices to be projected within it. Naming, and I'm quoting from the book my text, naming is a process of fixing an identity and constructing knowledge. As such, naming is an activity that requires power, the power to fixate, and has inevitable consequences. The fixation of an identity always happens according to one prevailing ideology. Due to its nature, naming the urban void appears to be inherently contradictory, as fixing its identity would certainly cause its delicate qualities to vanish. However, it is also necessary to define the urban void in order for its qualities to be understood, valued, and ultimately protected. So a glossary is a dictionary assembled for a specific subject. A glossary defines the parlance to be shared by those involved with that subject. Through its terms, a glossary gives precise presence to what used to only have fuzzy edges. So by collecting all the existing terms, a glossary of urban voids is an attempt to respectfully and consciously define the urban void without filling it by naming it with a new singular term. And because of this, a glossary, I would argue, can become the means for naming the unnamable. The glossary is an attempt to define that which should have no precise definition, to close on a space that needs to remain open, and to bring to the forefront a space that must remain marginal. However, there's a very big difference between the glossary that I'm proposing, or that I have written, and the dictionaries as they are typically understood. And here there's like 3 dictionaries. All dictionaries aim to give precision and understanding. Their role is to define reality. They want to establish identities and differences. My glossary actually dwells on ambiguity, which is almost the opposite of what a dictionary should be. So here we have the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française, Viollet-le-Duc, where he famously defined the term restoration that had huge impacts, many of them very, very negative, in the restoration and preservation practices. We also have the Quincy's dictionary, where, as you all probably know, he defined the term type, a term that has built on many other disciplinary discourses, but the origin was there. And also John Stilgoe, the Shallow Water Dictionary, a book incredibly beautifully written, and a book that foresees, it's a book from the mid-90s, a book that foresees the value and the importance of shallow water as we now embarked on understanding and experiencing the effects of climate change. There are other recent dictionaries that I think fall within this category of dictionary, aiming to give precision and understanding. One would be Landmarks by Robert McFarland, or also Homeground, Language for an American Landscape, edited by Barry Lopez and Deborah Wartney. My glossary is different, and in some ways opposes that. It is a subversive and unusual version of the typical section number 2, definitions of planning documents. Here, as we have the Massachusetts land use and the Cambridge building code. Ambiguity is very difficult to capture and protect. The fixity of a dictionary is antithetical to the purposes and spirit of ambiguity. This glossary, paradoxically, or even absurdly, aims to dwell in ambiguity. It demonstrates its existence by compiling terms, but it also aims to protect it by not fixing it according to one single sensibility. The term void is a tricky one, as some of you might know. It typically projects bad connotations when discussing urban spaces, and thus the expression urban void could be misunderstood. In fact, people interested in the redefinition of the city according to other ideologies or points of view that are not exclusively economic might argue that these spaces are not empty, and in fact, they are full of other alternative, non-economic potentials. Due to their marginality, these spaces offer opportunities, ecological, social, for example, that other spaces do not and cannot. Following this line of thought, some people have argued that different terms should be used. However, the term void is not used in this book to imply that these spaces are emptied of everything. Rather, so void does not imply vacuum. Rather, void implies a space of the possible, of expectation, of the removal of that prevailing ideology. Here we have like several definitions of void, and I would like to read number 14 because it points to some of the dangers also of the void. This is Van Dicht. A cultural history of the void would coincide to a large extent with that of colonialism. Colonists were attracted by the empty spots still to be found 100 years ago on globes and maps. And also number 15, the colonies were the no man's land territories fit to be defined and or treated as void of human habitation, as well as the void of sovereign administration, and thus open to clamoring for colonization and settlements. And that's Gilles Doran quoting Sigmund Bauman. And so in those cases, I would argue that void was understood as vacuum, and which is not the way that I argue that void is typically understood within the expression urban void. And another very good, accurate description of this perception is the one by William Cronon, Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England, where he says, more importantly, English colonists could use Indian hunting and gathering as a justification for expropriating Indian land. To European eyes, Indians appear to squander the resources that were available to them. Indian poverty was the result of Indian waste. Underused land, underused natural abundance, underused human labor. This aim to optimize. Because the Indians were so few and do but run over the grass, as do also the foxes and wild beasts, Cushman declared their land to be spacious and void, free for English taking. And I think that this association between optimization, exploitation, production, and the idea of void as a vacuum is something that is very rooted within Western ideology. The term void, I think, needs to be understood in a different way, and it must be understood in a different way. Here, Lyotard makes a very interesting argument. This is in this interview with Gary Olson, Resisting a Discourse of Mastery, where he says, the capitalist way is to grasp in very real terms. Capitalist as a system has the function to optimize its performances. But he says, maybe it's important for the system to renounce the need to grasp and to master, and instead to open blank fields, blank spaces, empty spaces in order to let events happen. I think that the urban void the term void in the way that is used in the book and the way that I would argue must be used produces or encapsulates that position, shifting the point of view from the idea of vacuum to the idea of being emptied of the prevailing ideology. So in using the term void, I imply a combination of activity, recognition, protection, and design with a certain passivity. Let things happen. To form the void ultimately without colonizing it with a single culture. And therefore, I think that the glossary is a very useful tool for not just demonstrating and showing the wide variety of sensibilities, but also to do that through the format of the book itself. The Glossary of Urban Voids was published by Yobis in early 2020. And I always want to thank my editor, Nina Bergest, for her patience. The book was very, very beautifully designed by Julie Cho from Omnivore. And as you can see here, and as you have seen already throughout the lecture, throughout the presentation, each spread is laid out in this way. On the left, you have the definitions. On the right, you have the text, and each side has been formatted according to its most typical layout. So on the left, the glossary has like 2 columns, font sans serif. On the right, we have a larger, like a single column, obviously, larger margins, fonts with serif, slightly smaller, etc. The terms and the definitions have been extracted from a very wide variety of texts. And while the process of extracting terms, definitions, and descriptors has relied in many cases in my own personal interpretation, obviously, the definitions that I list are exact quotes. I would like to talk a little bit about this dual, these like 2 books in one. And this is Neni Panurgia, Fragments of Death, Fables of Identity, a book that I adore and I admire. Neni Panurgia, a Greek anthropologist, she documents in this book the death of her grandfather. And she does that, she talks about death, but in one chapter of the book, she does this by having 2 points of view at the same time, simultaneously. One is her point of view as the granddaughter. The other one is the point of view of her as the anthropologist. And they run parallel in the book. And so she says that they are divided into 2 narratives that complement each other, Thanatos and Parerga. The first provides the description, the second, the analysis. Because the 2 chapters are so tightly connected and the analysis corresponds almost organically with the narration, and I'm quoting, I have placed them parallel to each other, Thanatos on top, Parerga underneath it. You might read them separately, or you might read them alternatively, or you might glance Parerga while reading Thanatos. A parergon is something subordinate or accessory. And Neni Panurgia has argued that, I quote, Parerga are not commentaries. They do not interrogate a stable main text or invite further commentary. Rather, they are in a sense what Derrida has called a lean-on, a space where I, the author, offer you, the readers, the chance to hold on to something, an idea, an explanation, a question, an interrogation, a dissent. Together, they are a meta text that seeks to unseat any certainties that might exist in the main text, any convictions that might have developed in the narrative. And so using the parergon as a structuring device, a glossary of urban voids has been written and is organized as 2 interrelated threads, the glossary and the essay. The essay does not illustrate the definitions any more than the definitions provide a context for the essay. Both the definitions and the essay act as subordinates, as parerga to each other. They are constantly questioning any certainties that might have arose, dwelling in ambiguity while asserting the importance of this kind of space. And so to me, the book is important from a pedagogic point of view, learning alternative options of how to name things. From a disciplinary point of view, putting different disciplines, urban planning and design, architecture, landscape in conversation through the use of terms. Also politically, because these are alternative ways of using and defining vocabularies. The reintroduction of ambiguity is crucial. And finally, artistically, or poetically, rather, how to talk about what isn't there. At the end of the book, there's a list of terms, and I would like to just read a few of them to finish. There's like several that you might find that are redundant, like for example, abandoned areas, abandoned lot, abandoned property, abandoned space, abandoned structures, abandoned urban landscapes. But I write in the book that individual authors have typically preferred to use one term over the other. And for this reason, several seemingly anonymous group of terms have all been included. And I have done this because I have attempted to interpret and respect the author's selection of words to the best of my ability. And therefore, I hope that the readers can benefit from these differences subtleties, even at sometimes they might appear slightly superfluous. But there's like some that I find very, very beautiful. Artificial landscape without cultural precedent, dumps of non-historical past, interior islands void of activity, open grounds for wholly indeterminate futures, reserves of indeterminacy, reserves of open land of indeterminate status, those marvelous empty zones at the edge of cities, wastes of successive occupations, and then obviously finally urban voids. Thank you very much for your attention. That was it.
Thank you very much, Sergio. That was like a book come to life with the tone of a human, and I can't thank you enough for sharing the time with us. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat or announce yourself in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. I'll start off while that process starts, perhaps, and I will try to dwell in ambiguity in phrasing my question to kind of match your essay. I think clearly the form of the glossary frames your research in terms of the power of words to delimitate the realm of thought, and that if space always has an agenda and words always have an agenda, then words about space have kind of multiple agendas. I picked out maybe a few of my favorite words, or words I never really considered as terms of urban voids from your work, like a Maidan, like a gangland, and I'm thinking of a Vito Conci quote where Vito Conci says, public space is a deal, right? Public space belongs to us all, and we in turn belong to the state. So maybe I'll pick gangland, but feel free to pick any word. I mean, like, who does gangland belong to, and what is the implication for the rest of us?
Yeah, that is an important aspect. I think that there's definitely risks to that kind of open-endedness that are crucial. Gangland in this context, it comes from the study of David Thrasher of Chicago's empty spaces in the early 20th century, where he argued that they were like these vacant areas in between different parts of Chicago that saw that the rise of different gangs in Chicago in the early 20th century, and that this kind of space that was not monitored, that was didn't have an owner, so to speak, were very useful, very appropriate for the development of those kinds of sociabilities, and that's where the term comes into being. I agree that the public space requires a certain contract of sorts, a certain social contract. I think, though, that in many cases the opportunities that arise in these kind of spaces that are outside of the typical norms are very, very useful. But true, there are inherent, very, very, very clear risks to that situation. They shouldn't be undermined or diminished. From my point of view, I take the position that the risk typically in a democratic society is worth taking, but that's my own position. But clearly there are risks. The quote that I read earlier from Campos regarding the accidental playground, it's a good example. He said that there were also illicit activities and that there was a place without explicit rules. You could do whatever you wanted with the understanding that other people could also do the same. And that in general, the experience was mostly peaceful. But obviously there are instances where that is not the case. That is true, absolutely. Again, I think regardless of my own personal position, which I argue in the book, I think that the book as a glossary also allows other people to take their own positions. So the inclusion of the glossary in the book also allows other positions, other opinions on this matter to be taken, using the book as a ground for that, without having to take my own position or my own understanding of the question.
Thank you for that response. We have a question from Tahir Abdelghani, who asked, or who says, brilliant lecture. One small question. Do you think spaces within informal settlements can be referred to as voids?
Spaces within informal settlements? That was the question?
Yeah, within informal settlements.
I mean, I don't know what kind of space is being referred to. I mean, if it's a space that is being used in a similar manner as other spaces within an informal settlement, I wouldn't recognize it as a void because I think that they are being used in a similar manner. I mean, I'm not sure exactly at what type of space. I think that there's the possibility of the existence of urban voids within within informal settlements, but I don't think every space within an informal settlement is an urban void.
Valeria Mia Ujarte asks, what kind of strategies can be used in an architectural intervention in an urban void, in specific a heritage one?
Yeah, so this is something that I haven't talked a lot about in today's lecture, but this is something that is included in the book. There's one chapter, if I remember correctly. You write a book and it's such an effort that then when you're done, you just want to forget about it, frankly. But if I remember correctly, there's a chapter that is called Protecting the Void. I think that this is the first act should be to protect it. So from my point of view, and this is something that I talk about in the book, the main design act should be in taking care of the perimeter, taking care of the edge, figuring out how that space can negotiate with any neighboring sites, figuring out how it can be protected in some way, figuring out how it can provide access. To me, that's where the first design act should be concerned with. The edge, the perimeter, the holding the footprint, so to speak. Then in regards to the interior space, so to speak, that I think that there's like a wide variety of possibilities. And I think that it would be like a range of options going from options which to a certain extent are so heavy-handed that in a way almost erase the quality of the urban void to the ones that leave the urban void completely untouched. But I think that would be a matter of the context, the designer's position or taste or ethical, political position, the regulations and so on. But to me, the first thing that one has to pay attention to is the perimeter, the edge. That's the question that one should attempt to hold, to keep, to protect.
Well, and then just maybe following up on that question, you mentioned early in your lecture that kind of your conception of urban voids has this dichotomy or this pharmacon of being both like a site of failure and a site of potential that is like kind of unprogrammed. Once we program it, do we kind of absolve it of its failure, but also kind of limit its potential?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they should be programmed. I think that the minute that they are programmed, or at least permanently, I think that the minute they are programmed, they are claimed according to some constituency, according to some agency, to whoever has to maintain it, to a specific audiences, publics, ages. I think it becomes an issue. I think that there's a possibility of, I don't know, like an alternative constant program and reprogramming of the space. And I think that some people have looked at this. I mean, from my point of view, I believe that the lack of program produces a lack of claiming that is at the end of the day very, very valuable. But again, that is my own position. I think that there's a variety of possibilities and solutions, also depending on where this place is located. I typically tend to not see things in absolute terms. So I think that, there's like moments in which places that are currently being seen as urban void could be occupied in a way that they resemble more a typical public space, but maybe that's what's appropriate in that particular space. But in general, I think that the programming is a way of domesticating, of suburbanizing, so to speak, the wilderness of the urban void. Some people have talked about this. I haven't quoted him, but Jason Young has like this very interesting article on the emptiness of Detroit, in which he writes. He has like a very beautiful sentence where he says like, transforming the urban void into a public space is akin as suburbanizing it. And then he talks about he runs against this attempt to fill in emptiness, and giving it program is a way of filling it. And he argues against it in interesting ways. He talks about the fullness of the density of emptiness. It's a very interesting article for those of you that might be interested in that point of view.
Sorry, I learned it's hard to host and write down notes at the same time, so that's something to practice. We have a question from Aaron Hill, who says, great talk, thanks very much. The endeavor to represent spaces characterized by ambiguity, vagary, or a lack of firm definition offers a challenging paradox to show us what's not there. Could you share a bit, I'll add the word please, could you please share a bit about how you thought through a representational approach for the book? And to that, I'll add, you had some very evocative kind of, as you said, urban photography in your presentation. And the pictures are not, and your book just contains words and some kind of black and white satellite imagery. So.
Yeah, I mean, so two answers to this. I think there's been a lot of urban photography that have captured this all the way since the mid 1970s, and John Davis and many others have attempted to capture that sensibility. I would still go back and look at how those pictures were taken, and the kind of opportunities that they open up. In terms of how one can draw that kind of space as a designer, I think it's a little bit more tricky, but I would start by documenting what is there. And again, by holding the perimeter. I think that holding the perimeter to me is fundamental. Hold the perimeter, that's where the main design activity should go, and then inside document what's there. And then let's see what happens. That would be my recipe of my rule of thumb, or what I've tried in different cases. In relation to the pictures that are included in the book, I really wanted to have photography that was very systematic, in a similar way as the glossary itself. So I wanted to have images that either were taken always by the same photographer with the same camera, from a similar height, from a similar point of view, or that were taken by many different photographers, but with like always the same point of view. So I did look at a wide variety of possibilities. I didn't want to include the pictures of only one photographer that seemed to be like showcasing the sensibility of one particular person. I looked at photographers that are more like within a realist position, an aesthetic position, or more like an objective, aesthetics of objectivity. I didn't find anything that I liked or that I thought was accurate. I looked at databases of pictures taken by different people, typically from the car, because I thought that then the camera would always be approximately in the same place. Right. But the pictures were not interesting enough, and so finally I took the decision to make them from an aerial point of view, and particularly to zoom in and look in a way to document the textures, the ground conditions, and some of the activities that might be happening there. those pictures are always taken at the same altitude, and they have the same size, they have the same resolution. There's a certain systematic nature in how they've been taken, and I thought that removed in some ways from the equation, although in a similar way that it removes me from the glossary in some way, although finally, ultimately, I am the one that is making the selection. So that is not totally true, but I wanted to find that balance. Yeah.
I think we've lost Nick, so I'll just carry on to the next
Determine
question.
these spaces.
And Nick, we lost you there for a minute. Could you repeat that?
Sorry.
No
How
worries.
embarrassing.
No
Christos asks, how can one speak with such generalities of urban voids? Doesn't context and specificity determine these spaces?
Well, again, this is something that I haven't talked about today, but I think, and I'm not the only one, a lot of people have argued that urban voids are actually look very similar regardless of where they are. In the book, I argue that actually urban voids are almost the opposite of spaces of the highest economic investment. So we have seen and we have talked, we have discussed things like airports or malls, shopping malls, or glass curtain walls. And we have discussed our office spaces, and we have discussed endlessly at how self-similar they are all throughout the planet, regardless of where they are located, regardless of the climate, regardless of the context. And this is because they follow very specific rules of financial and economic production, very specific rules about space occupation. They are following one economic paradigm. I would put urban voids exactly at the other end of the spectrum. And so if airports, shopping malls are over-specified and they remove any influence, mostly any influence of the context in many different ways, urban voids are absolutely under-specified. And in a similar manner, they produce such self-similarity because of the lack of relationship to the rules that to the financial or economic rules of a city. So they are specificities that appear in them. So if they have been polluted, there will be specific types of soil. If they are like within particular neighborhoods, they might have like different preponderance of uses or constituents. If they're like in other climates, they might appear like different plant species, but the way that they look, they're very similar, very self-similar. It's very difficult to tell where they are located in the globe, very difficult to distinguish them, similar as it happens with airports or shopping malls or hotels or high-end office parks. There's like a point in which the context becomes impossible. They are absolutely disassociated from their environment. And I see the urban void as a complete opposite of that over-specified type of dealing with space. They're completely under-specified. And in the book, I didn't talk about that today, but in the book, I discussed the aesthetics of under-specification and how that is part of what allows for such commonality, but also such openness.
Ellie Harfouche asks or says, arguments towards naming / qualifying spaces as voids are mostly physical, geographical, and use-based. But what about a temporal dimension? Was it considered as influential in your consideration of definitions? And maybe if I could add to that question, it's kind of like, are some types of urban voids just a bank, right? Is this space wasted right now, but it's really just held in surplus to be used for as its capital later on, say,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. there's one chapter in the book that is dedicated to the temporary qualities and conditions of the urban void. And I mean, many authors have talked about this. There's a way of like, depending on the authors, one could look at this as there's lots of time framed in space, or as spaces framed in time. And there's different authors have put more emphasis on the spatial qualities or more emphasis on the temporariness or the temporal qualities of this kind of space. Ultimately, the urban void has a certain temporariness, not just in itself, but also in its occupations. The occupations are also always temporary, or at least they should be, because otherwise it's no longer a void in that way. So the temporality and the temporal nature of this kind of space is very, very important. In regards to, are they sometimes being held as capital itself, as a bank of sorts? Yes, true, that happens. I think in many ways that is something that was the position that was being taken by most urban planners in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's like, okay, this is actually, there's an economic potential here. Why are we not exploiting it? Why is this not coming to fruition? I think that's a well-known point of view, and it's definitely a possibility. I don't think that we lack from that. I don't think we lack from tools in order to develop that option.
Iman Gorgul says, thank you so much for this inspiring lecture. Just wondering, can you elaborate a bit more on the political capacities of the urban void? And to which I guess I'll add again, your lecture and your writings make me think of Hakim Bey's work on the temporary autonomous zone, right? Also from, I guess, the 70s or 80s, where he's like, occupy space, do whatever you want, and move on before the authorities come. And I'm kind of thinking that urban voids, it's almost like occupy space, do whatever you want. The authorities are never coming for you in voids. You're almost invisible. You're, as you said, you're outside of capitalism. But what are the political capacities of the urban void?
Yeah, Hakim Bey and his task, the temporary autonomous zone, is also included in the book as a very interesting manifesto. I think that the political capacities are limited because of that outside, or at least they are. Their visibility is limited, and I think that is one of the gray zones, or one of the difficulties in that context. For example, Dougal Sheridan's images that I showed here today, and he has many in that article. I mean, clearly, the inhabitants of the Wagendorf and of many other empty spaces in Berlin in the early 1990s, they were really demonstrating a very interesting alternative set of lifestyles that you could take as a whole, as a political stance on how to live in a city. But I think that individually, you have to look for them. They are not demonstratively being visible, or they're not demonstratively claiming that position. I think that that visibility only appears when the authorities show up, so to speak. So in the case of Tempelhof Airport, the political capacity of that public space only appeared when there was the threat of it being developed into a standard type of Berlin. It was only at that point when people like raised their voices. Otherwise, it was not part of the discussion, so to speak. I think that there's like a lack of visibility that is fundamental or important to a certain extent to this type of spaces. And when they become too visible, then they lack that openness. So it's a little bit of a pull and push kind of situation. I think that the political power it's limited because of the need for any kind of political action to be ultimately very, very visible.
Thanks. Well, that that gels so succinctly with a question from Mike Chai-Bon, who says, "Do you think the extensive study of voids eventually leads to the attention towards their potential exploitation and perhaps the mishandling of them by those who do not respect or protect these voids?"
Yeah, of course, for sure. Yeah, no question. I mean, well, we all know that mapping can be both a defensive tool, but also a tool for colonization, so to speak. So, I mean, clearly, that is another question. Yeah.
Sure, and then maybe we'll have time for one or two final questions. B. Letterin writes, in the text of Morales, he describes the terrain vague as a place where, open quote, the performers seek refuge in the margins of the city of crushing homogeneity, end quote. The question continues, does the void or terrain vague only relate to the physical, or can it also relate to the mental terrain vague that lives within places of the city?
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't think it's exclusively physical. I think that's well pointed out. I think it's psychological as well. I talk about this. I think I've barely talked about this today, but yeah, there are spaces of seclusion. There's like a certain hidden nature, again, because of its lack of visibility, that allows for a certain psychological relief. And so I think that I think that kind of like opportunity from a mental point of view, I think is very valuable. I do think that was also very well captured in some of the images by urban photographers earlier on. So that picture of John Davis that I showed today, and many others that he have, especially some of them actually in Spain, I think that kind of certain solitude, certain loneliness, a certain a certain seclusion, I think that is very poetically captured in those pictures. And I think Morales talks about it within the book, within his text in that way. And then I pick on that, but obviously I'm not the one that has first pointed towards that. But yes, I think that seclusion is crucial. In somewhere in the book, apologies, I don't remember exactly in what chapter, but I talk about how a lot of important cultural moments have happened from places that were outside of culture initially. And I think that we've seen this also, for example, from religious points of view. Most religious leaders, whether you believe in those religions or whether you believe that they are myths, come to their conclusions outside of culture. They are in secluded spaces. They are out in the desert. They are out in a cave. They are out under a tree, in the forest. So actually those spaces of sudden enlightenment and a new way of living happens in such seclusion outside of culture. And so, obviously there has not been a discussion around the religious or symbolic or spiritual nature of the urban void, but I do think that they do offer such a possibility by being outside of the urban fabric and outside of culture as well.
Thank you. And I guess maybe perhaps just one final question. Hoke Song says, thank you for the thoughtful talk. The flexible free spaces that you speak about, are more plentiful in other cultures. It goes on, here we live in post-colonial European urban design paradigms. Your talk reminds us how focused our models have been and are, and maybe just by way of concluding, it just kind of like what kind of cross-cultural research do you think your book presents?
Yeah, I mean, in the book I say that primarily the point of view it dwells or takes on a Western tradition. Although these are species that can be found everywhere, because the most pervasive understanding of the cities is common to the industrial economic developments that we have experienced in the last 200 years. But the conceptualization of the term is primarily Western. I think that there's several authors that have talked about this, that have used the term or similar terms, but have applied it and have used to read other types of spaces in other cultures. Particularly, for example, in the two readers that I've presented today, there's like authors that have used this way of thinking about the urban void in order to interpret other spatial conditions or types of spaces in other spaces that are not exclusively Western. So there's like that possibility of doing that cross-reading, but for sure, the tradition, the cultural and intellectual tradition that the question of the term of the urban void is built upon is primarily Western, without any kind of doubt. I haven't written about this in the book, but maybe as a way of finishing, or wrapping up, all my work is concentrated on questions of emptiness, and I think that there's like very fundamental differences in the way that Western thought and Eastern thought have constructed the idea of the world and have interacted with it. Western thought is based upon the idea of substance. This is a fundamental conception from Greek thought and Aristotelian understanding of the world. The question is, what is there? And substance defines its own identity and its presence in differentiating itself from others. Eastern thought primarily, not exclusively, but primarily through its Buddhist roots, are based on emptiness, on the fact that there's no differentiation between one and the other, on the fact that there's just one that encompasses everything. This is not just Buddhist thought, Taoist thought, which is some of the roots of, at least half of the roots of Chinese philosophy, also encompasses a similar point of view. And so I think that this is something that I'm starting to look at and trying to understand how to, I'm not saying combine both of them or synthesize them, but I think that this is an interesting differentiation that is many times overlooked in our ways of understanding space or teaching about space, despite the fact that we are in a very multicultural, global academic and practicing environment. I think that we need to understand that the way that we think about emptiness and therefore voids actually can come from two radically opposing systems of thought and systems of portraying and ultimately interacting with the world. So I don't have an answer to that question, but I don't talk about this at all in the book. But that is something that I am right now looking at and trying to understand how to engage with this difference. I think that it's a very intellectually stimulating, but ultimately maybe impossible task. We have to accept that difference. And if we have been educated in one or the other, we have to make an effort to try to educate ourselves in the other point of view. And this is particularly when it comes to emptiness, I think it holds in many aspects the key to that transfer of point of view. So that's what, to me, the void suggests or implies, beyond, and again, this is a very general comment, but beyond the content of this book and beyond the content of the urban void itself.
Okay, well, thank you, Sergio, Nick, and all the participants who submitted their questions for this engagement. Just to wrap things up, again, Sergio, we're so thankful on behalf of Daniels for you to share your expertise with us. We would also like to thank our Daniels Public Programming Committee for organizing this year's series. To see the rest of the Daniels events this year, just head to the Daniels website, which is daniels.utoronto.ca, and click on News and Events, which is on the left column. And the next event in the series is Architecture in Dialogue, 14th cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture Symposium, coming up on Thursday, November 19, 2020. And we hope to see you then, and make a good day.
Thank you so much again. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Sergio.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Nick.
Great talk.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you,
Thank you,
Michael.
Sergio. And so nice meeting you and chatting with you.
Great. Thank you very much.